Commander Sarah Chen stood in the briefing room at Naval Air Station Oceana, staring at the assignment orders that had just changed everything. The paper felt heavier than it should, weighted with 15 years of carefully guarded secrets. Around her, other pilots shuffled through their own paperwork, excited chatter filling the room about the new FA-18 Super Hornet squadron being formed. She remained silent, her mind racing through calculations she had hoped never to make. The transition from desk duty to active flight operations should have been routine. Sarah had spent the last decade and a half building an impeccable record as a naval aviator, flying transport missions, conducting training exercises, and slowly climbing the ranks. Her service jacket showed nothing unusual, just another competent officer who had earned her wings and kept her nose clean. Nobody questioned the 3-year gap early in her career. The missing time explained away by medical leave and reassignment paperwork that few bothered to examine closely. But Sarah remembered every second of those 3 years. The cold water of the Pacific during Hell Week, the endless runs through soft sand that seemed designed to break human legs, the weapons training, the tactical operations, the missions she could never speak about. She had been part of naval special warfare, one of the few women to complete the program when it finally opened to female candidates. She had operated in places that did not officially exist, done things that would never appear in any public record. The decision to leave had not been easy. After a mission in the South China Sea went sideways, after she had carried 2 wounded teammates through 12 miles of hostile territory, after the medals they gave her in a closed ceremony that no family could attend, Sarah had looked at her future and seen only more secrets, more shadows. She wanted to fly. She wanted the sky and the freedom it represented. So she had requested a transfer, and the Navy, understanding the value of discretion, had quietly arranged for her SEAL history to be buried so deep that even most admirals could not access it. Now, 15 years later, that past felt like it was crawling up from the depths. The Super Hornet assignment was a dream posting, the kind of opportunity most naval aviators would sacrifice plenty to receive. These were not transport planes or training aircraft. These were frontline fighters, the cutting edge of American naval aviation. Flying one meant potential combat deployments, high-stakes missions, and a level of scrutiny that Sarah had carefully avoided for over a decade. She folded the orders and slipped them into her flight jacket, nodding politely as Captain Morrison began the formal briefing. He was a stern-faced man with silver hair and a reputation for running tight squadrons. He spoke about readiness, about the increasing tensions in the Pacific, about Chinese expansion and Russian provocations. The world was heating up again, he said, and the Navy needed its best pilots ready for anything. Sarah listened with the practiced attention of someone who had heard similar briefings in very different contexts. She noted the tactical details, the potential deployment zones, the mission profiles they would be training for, air superiority, ground support, reconnaissance, electronic warfare. The Super Hornet could do it all, and they would be expected to master every capability. After the briefing ended, pilots clustered in small groups, introducing themselves and sizing each other up. Sarah recognized a few faces from previous postings, but most were strangers. She shook hands with Lieutenant Commander Jake Russo, a cocky pilot from Florida who had apparently shot down 2 enemy drones during a classified operation near Yemen. He grinned at her with the easy confidence of someone who had never truly been tested. Then there was Captain Emily Vance, a quiet woman from Oregon who had more carrier landings than anyone else in the room. She studied Sarah with sharp eyes, the kind that saw more than most people wanted to reveal. Sarah smiled politely and kept her answers brief when Emily asked about her background. Transport missions, she said. Logistics support. Nothing exciting. The lie came easily after so many years, but it tasted bitter. Sarah had always hated deception, even when necessary. In the teams, honesty was survival. You trusted your teammates with your life, and that trust was built on truth. But that life was supposed to be behind her now, sealed away in classified files that would probably outlive her. As the group dispersed to inspect their assigned aircraft, Sarah walked across the tarmac toward her new Super Hornet. The late afternoon sun glinted off its gray hull, and she felt the familiar rush of anticipation that came with approaching a beautiful machine. She ran her hand along the fuselage, feeling the smooth composite materials, the carefully engineered curves designed to slice through air at speeds most people could barely imagine. A crew chief approached. a young petty officer with grease-stained hands and an eager expression. He started explaining the aircraft's systems, walking her through the upgrades that had been installed since the latest maintenance cycle. Sarah listened and asked technical questions that surprised him. She had done her homework, studying the Super Hornet's capabilities during every spare moment since learning about the assignment. What the crew chief did not know, what nobody on this base knew, was that Sarah had actually flown combat missions in earlier model Hornets during her time with Special Operations. The Navy had needed pilots who could insert SEAL teams in hostile territory, who could provide close air support when missions went wrong, who could fly low and fast through radar networks designed to catch anything in the air. She had been one of those pilots, operating off small carriers in waters where America was not officially present. That experience had taught her things that most fighter pilots never learned. She knew what it felt like to have surface-to-air missiles tracking her aircraft. She knew how to fly so low that her landing gear almost touched ocean waves. She knew the sound a human body makes when struck by cannon fire, and she knew how to live with that sound afterward. But here at Oceana, she was just Commander Chen, just another pilot earning her place in a prestigious squadron. She thanked the crew chief and climbed up to inspect the cockpit, settling into the ejection seat and letting her hands find the familiar controls. The instrument panel glowed with digital displays, showing her information that older pilots had to imagine. She ran through mental checklists, her fingers dancing over switches and buttons with practiced precision. As the sun set behind the hangars, casting long shadows across the flight line, Sarah sat alone in her cockpit and allowed herself one moment of honest reflection. She had built a good life in the regular Navy. She had friends, respect, a career trajectory that made sense. The nightmares from her SEAL days had faded to occasional disturbances rather than nightly terrors. She had learned to sleep without a weapon under her pillow. But deep down, in a place she rarely examined, Sarah knew the truth. She missed it. She missed the intensity, the clarity of purpose, the feeling of operating at the absolute edge of human capability. Flying transports had been safe and comfortable, but it had also been boring. The Super Hornet assignment thrilled her not just because it was prestigious, but because it was dangerous. Because it would push her again, test her again, remind her what she was capable of. She just hoped it would not require her to reveal who she really was. The Navy had secrets, and so did she. For 15 years, those secrets had remained buried. Now strapped into a fighter jet that might see actual combat, Sarah Chen wondered how long her carefully constructed cover story could survive. The morning air was crisp and cold when Sarah arrived for her first training flight in the Super Hornet. She had barely slept, her mind too active with memories and preparations. The pre-flight briefing had been thorough, covering weather conditions, training objectives, and safety protocols. Captain Morrison had assigned her a simple shakedown flight, just basic maneuvers to familiarize herself with the aircraft's handling characteristics. Nothing complicated for a first outing. Sarah suited up in the locker room, pulling on her flight suit with the same methodical care she had once used to check her combat gear before SEAL missions. Each zipper, each pocket, each piece of equipment had its place and purpose. Her helmet sat on the bench beside her, visor gleaming under the fluorescent lights. She studied her reflection in a nearby mirror and saw a woman who looked calm, professional, ready. Nobody would guess at the tension coiling in her chest. Walking to the aircraft, she passed other pilots preparing for their own flights. Jake Russo was already in his cockpit, running through his checklist with the enthusiastic energy of a kid on Christmas morning. He gave her a thumbs up as she passed, and she returned the gesture with a smile that did not quite reach her eyes. Emily Vance was standing beside her own aircraft, deep in conversation with her crew chief about some technical detail. She glanced up as Sarah approached, offering a brief nod of acknowledgement. The crew chief assigned to Sarah's aircraft was a different person today, an older master chief named Rodriguez, who had apparently been maintaining Navy fighters since before Sarah was born. He greeted her with professional courtesy and handed her the maintenance log, pointing out a minor hydraulic issue that had been resolved overnight. Sarah scanned the paperwork, asking questions that revealed her deeper understanding of aircraft systems. Rodriguez raised an eyebrow but said nothing, simply helping her complete the external inspection. Every panel, every surface, every opening received Sarah's attention. She checked the weapons hardpoints even though they were empty for this training flight. She examined the landing gear, the air intakes, the control surfaces. This was more than regulation required, but old habits from special operations died hard. In that world, a missed detail could mean death. Rodriguez seemed to appreciate her thoroughness, nodding approvingly as she signed off on the pre-flight inspection. Climbing into the cockpit felt like coming home to a place she had never lived. The Super Hornet was different from the older models she had secretly flown years ago, but the fundamental layout was familiar. Her hands moved across the controls with confidence, flipping switches and checking systems with the smooth efficiency of muscle memory. The aircraft came alive around her, displays illuminating, computers running through their startup sequences, the whole machine transitioning from inert metal to living weapon. Tower cleared her for taxi, and Sarah guided the fighter toward the runway. The feeling of power was intoxicating even at ground speeds. This was not a lumbering transport or a training aircraft with forgiving handling. This was a machine built for violence, designed to dominate airspace and destroy anything that challenged it. The twin engines hummed behind her, barely restrained, waiting for her to unleash their full potential. At the runway threshold, she ran through final checks while waiting for clearance. Her breathing was steady, her heartbeat calm despite the adrenaline beginning to flow through her veins. This was the moment she had been working toward for 15 years. The return to real flying after so long in the comfortable margins of naval aviation. The tower controller's voice crackled through her headset, giving her clearance for takeoff. Sarah advanced the throttle smoothly, feeling the engines respond with a building roar. The Super Hornet accelerated down the runway, speed increasing with startling rapidity. The world outside began to blur as she approached rotation speed. She pulled back on the stick, and the aircraft lifted gracefully into the Virginia sky, climbing away from the earth with the eager energy of a predator released from its cage. The moment the wheels left the ground, something inside Sarah shifted. The careful control she had maintained for so many years loosened slightly, allowing instincts she had suppressed to surface. Her hands moved across the controls with fluid precision, making micro-adjustments that kept the aircraft perfectly trimmed as she climbed. She retracted the landing gear and accelerated, pushing the Super Hornet higher and faster. Tower handed her off to departure control, and she acknowledged with crisp professionalism while privately marveling at the aircraft's responsiveness. Every input she made was met with immediate, precise response. The flight control computers interpreted her intentions and translated them into perfect aerodynamic movements. This was flying at a level she had forgotten was possible. Following the assigned route, Sarah climbed to 20,000 feet and began the training maneuvers Captain Morrison had outlined. Basic turns first, feeling how the aircraft handled at different speeds and altitudes. She rolled left and right, pulled through climbing and descending turns, tested the Super Hornet's agility with gentle inputs. Everything felt perfect, better than perfect. The aircraft was an extension of her body, responding to her thoughts almost before she moved the controls. But the basic maneuvers felt too simple, too safe. Sarah knew she was capable of more, much more. During her SEAL days, she had flown combat missions that would have terrified most pilots. She had dodged missiles, navigated through mountains at night without lights, landed on carriers during storms that should have grounded all aircraft. That experience whispered to her now, urging her to push harder, to truly test what the Super Hornet could do. She glanced at her fuel gauge and calculated time remaining. She was ahead of schedule, with plenty of fuel for the planned exercises. Nobody was watching directly, just radar controllers tracking her position. The training airspace was hers alone for the next 20 minutes. Sarah made a decision that she knew was probably unwise but could not resist. She rolled the Super Hornet inverted and pulled through a split S maneuver, diving toward the earth while pulling hard on the stick. The world spun around her as the aircraft traced a perfect arc through the sky. G-forces pushed her down into the seat, the anti-G suit inflating to keep blood in her brain. She grunted through the pressure, fighting to keep her vision clear as she completed the maneuver and leveled out at 15,000 feet. The rush was incredible. Sarah felt more alive in that moment than she had in years. She climbed again and executed a barrel roll, spiraling around an invisible point in space with textbook precision. Then a loop, pulling vertical and trading speed for altitude before diving back down the other side. Each maneuver was executed perfectly, her skills returning as if she had never stopped flying fighters. She pushed the Super Hornet through high G turns, testing the aircraft's limits and her own. The world grayed at the edges of her vision as she pulled 7Gs through a hard turn, but she maintained control, breathing properly and tensing her muscles to fight the forces trying to drain blood from her brain. She completed the turn and rolled out level, checking her instruments and smiling inside her oxygen mask. That was when she noticed the radio call she had missed during her focused flying. Captain Morrison's voice sharp with concern, asking for her position and status. Sarah's stomach dropped. She had gotten so caught up in the flying that she had missed a radio check. That was pilot error of the worst kind, the sort of mistake that got people killed in combat situations. She responded immediately, apologizing and reporting her position. Morrison's reply was terse, instructing her to return to the training profile and cut the unauthorized aerobatics. Sarah acknowledged, feeling heat rise in her cheeks despite the cockpit's climate control. This was exactly the kind of attention she had spent 15 years avoiding. She had let her skills and her excitement override her judgment. For the remaining time, she flew exactly as instructed, completing the assigned maneuvers with mechanical precision. No flourishes, no improvisation, just competent execution of basic fighter maneuvers. But the damage was done. Morrison had noticed her deviation from the flight plan, and worse, he would have seen her radar track showing maneuvers far more advanced than a pilot on her first Super Hornet flight should be attempting. The landing was perfect, at least. Sarah brought the fighter back to Oceana and executed a textbook approach, touching down smoothly and catching the arresting wire with practiced ease. She taxied back to the flight line and shut down the engines, sitting in the sudden silence of the cockpit while her heart rate slowly returned to normal. Rodriguez was waiting when she climbed down, and his expression was unreadable. He said nothing about her flight, just helped her with the post-flight inspection and took her debrief on the aircraft's performance. Sarah kept her comments technical and brief, noting a slight vibration in the stick during high-speed turns, but otherwise reporting excellent handling characteristics. Captain Morrison was waiting in the debrief room, and his face told Sarah everything she needed to know. She was in trouble. Not career-ending trouble, probably, but the kind of trouble that raised questions and attracted scrutiny. Exactly what she had been trying to avoid for 15 years. Captain Morrison sat behind his desk with Sarah's service record spread out in front of him. The office was sparse, decorated only with commendations and photographs from various deployments. Sarah stood at attention, keeping her eyes forward while her mind raced through possible explanations for her unauthorized aerobatics. None of them sounded convincing even to her. Morrison studied the paperwork in silence for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. Finally, he looked up at her with an expression that mixed curiosity with suspicion. He asked where she had learned to fly like that. Transport pilots did not execute 7G turns or combat maneuvers on their first flight in a new aircraft. Even experienced fighter pilots needed time to familiarize themselves with the Super Hornet's handling before attempting such aggressive flying. Sarah gave the only answer she could without revealing classified information. She explained that she had studied fighter tactics extensively, read every manual she could find, spent countless hours in simulators. It was partially true, though it omitted the years she had spent actually flying fighters in combat zones. Morrison listened without interrupting, his eyes never leaving her face. When she finished, he leaned back in his chair and pointed out several problems with her explanation. First, simulator time did not translate to that level of skill in actual flight. Second, her service record showed no fighter training, no advanced tactical courses, nothing that would explain her performance. Third, and most concerning, her file showed a 3-year gap early in her career with minimal documentation. Medical leave and administrative reassignment, according to the paperwork. But Morrison had been in the Navy long enough to recognize bureaucratic obfuscation when he saw it. Sarah felt her carefully constructed cover story beginning to crack. Morrison was not an idiot, and he had access to resources that could potentially uncover information she needed kept buried. She maintained her composure and repeated that her training history was accurately reflected in her service jacket. If he had questions about specific assignments, she suggested he contact the personnel office at the Pentagon. Morrison stared at her for another long moment, then closed her file and told her she was grounded, pending a full review of her qualifications. He wanted her medical records, her training certifications, and a complete flight history from every command she had served under. Until he was satisfied that she was properly qualified to fly the Super Hornet, she would be restricted to ground duties. Sarah acknowledged the order and was dismissed. Walking out of Morrison's office, Sarah felt 15 years of careful planning unraveling. She had known this assignment was risky, but she had convinced herself that she could maintain her cover. Now a suspicious commanding officer was asking exactly the questions she could not answer honestly. If Morrison pushed hard enough, if he contacted the right people at the Pentagon, he might stumble onto classified information that would raise even more questions. The next few days were uncomfortable. Sarah reported for duty each morning, but was assigned to administrative tasks instead of flying. She processed paperwork, attended briefings, and watched other pilots head out to the flight line while she remained grounded. Jake Russo made sympathetic noises and offered to speak to Morrison on her behalf, but Sarah declined. The last thing she needed was more attention. Emily Vance was more perceptive. She cornered Sarah in the ready room one afternoon and asked direct questions about her background. Where had she really served? What had she really done during those 3 years that showed up as medical leave? Emily had been around long enough to recognize classified assignments when she saw them carefully hidden in service records. Sarah deflected as best she could, but Emily was persistent. She pointed out that transport pilots did not fly like fighter aces on their first sortie. She noted that Sarah's comfort level with the aircraft system suggested far more experience than her official record indicated. She observed that Sarah carried herself with the controlled alertness of someone with combat experience, not the relaxed confidence of a pilot who had spent her career in relatively safe assignments. Finally, Emily made an offer that caught Sarah off guard. She said that whatever Sarah was hiding, it was clearly legitimate classified information rather than something shameful. Emily suggested that Sarah request a private meeting with Morrison and read him into whatever program she had been part of. Most commanders would respect classified operations and stop asking questions once they understood the situation required discretion. Sarah considered the suggestion carefully. Reading Morrison in would require contacting her old command and getting authorization to reveal at least some of her SEAL history. That would create a paper trail, alert people she had not spoken to in 15 years, and potentially drag her back into a world she had worked hard to leave behind. But the alternative was allowing Morrison to keep digging until he found information that might be even more problematic. She spent that night in her quarters, staring at her phone and debating whether to make the call. The number was still in her secure contacts, a direct line to Naval Special Warfare Command that she had promised herself she would never use again. Her finger hovered over the screen for almost an hour before she finally pressed dial. The voice that answered was unfamiliar. Some duty officer who asked for her credentials and purpose of call. Sarah identified herself using her old call sign and operational number, information she had not spoken aloud in over a decade. There was a long pause, then the sound of typing as the duty officer pulled up her file. When he came back on the line, his tone had shifted from bureaucratic boredom to sharp attention. He asked if she was currently in a secure location. Sarah confirmed that she was in her private quarters on a Navy base. The duty officer told her to stand by and transferred her to someone higher in the chain of command. Sarah waited, memories flooding back of similar calls she had made from considerably less comfortable locations. Desert safe houses, jungle clearings, once from a cargo container in a foreign port where she was definitely not supposed to be. The new voice belonged to Commander James Walsh, someone Sarah actually knew from her time in the teams. He had been a lieutenant back then, young and aggressive, and apparently he had stayed with Special Operations while she had moved on. His greeting was warm but cautious. He asked what had prompted her to contact Nessa Outsord after so long. Sarah explained her situation carefully, keeping her voice low, even though she was alone. New assignment, suspicious commanding officer. Questions about her background that she could not answer without authorization. She needed someone to speak with Captain Morrison and provide enough information to satisfy his concerns without compromising operational security. Walsh listened without interrupting, and Sarah could hear him typing in the background. He asked a few clarifying questions about Morrison's security clearance and what specifically had raised suspicions. Sarah described the flight and Morrison's subsequent investigation into her records. Walsh was silent for a moment, then told her he would handle it but warned that there would be consequences. The problem, Walsh explained, was that Sarah had spent 15 years maintaining complete separation from her SEAL background. She had deliberately avoided situations that might require revealing her special operations experience. Now she was asking Nessie dollars to partially declassify her service record, which would inevitably lead to questions about why she had hidden it for so long. Some people at the Pentagon might wonder if she was reliable, if she could be trusted with sensitive information when she had proven so adept at keeping secrets. Sarah had not considered that angle. She had thought of her hidden past as an asset, proof that she could maintain operational security. But Walsh was right that it could also be seen as problematic. The military valued transparency within its classification systems. Hiding a legitimate secret clearance and combat experience might be viewed as dishonest rather than discreet. Walsh promised to make some calls and get back to her within 48 hours. He advised her to say nothing to Morrison until NS Dollars had made contact. If the captain started asking more pointed questions, she should simply state that her previous assignments were classified and refer him to the Pentagon. Walsh also mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that people at NS Dollars would be interested to hear about her current assignment. Flying Super Hornets off carriers was exactly the kind of capability they sometimes needed. Sarah thanked him and ended the call, then sat in the darkness of her quarters considering what she had just set in motion. For 15 years she had successfully compartmentalized her life, keeping her SEAL past separate from her naval aviation career. Now those compartments were beginning to merge, and she was not sure whether the result would be opportunity or disaster. The next morning, she returned to her administrative duties with a sense of resigned anticipation. Morrison would either receive authorization to know the truth, or he would be told to back off and accept Sarah's cover story. Either way, her comfortable anonymity was ending. Other people would know her secrets, would see her differently, would expect things from her that she had spent years trying to escape. Jake Russo noticed her distraction and asked if she was okay. Morrison opened the classified folder, and Sarah saw her own face staring back from a photograph she barely recognized. Younger, harder, wearing tactical gear instead of a flight suit, the woman in that picture had eyes that had seen things most people never imagined, had done things that required a different kind of courage than flying fighter jets. Sarah kept her expression neutral while Morrison flipped through pages that documented parts of her life she had worked hard to forget. He read in silence for several minutes, occasionally glancing up at her with an expression that shifted from suspicion to surprise to something approaching respect. Finally, he closed the folder and leaned back in his chair, studying her with new eyes. He asked why she had never mentioned her special operations background, why she had spent 15 years pretending to be an ordinary transport pilot when she had capabilities far beyond what her official record showed. Sarah chose her words carefully. She explained that after leaving NSO, she had wanted a fresh start, a career where her value was not measured in missions she could never discuss or skills most people would never understand. She had wanted to fly without the weight of classified operations, to build a life that did not require constant vigilance and secrecy. The Navy had accommodated her request, burying her SEAL history deep enough that it would not interfere with her new path. Morrison listened, his fingers drumming softly on the desk. He pointed out that hiding such capabilities was not just unusual but potentially problematic. The Navy invested enormous resources in special operations training, and Sarah had essentially taken that training and walked away to fly cargo planes. It seemed like a waste of her potential, like she had been running from something rather than toward anything. The observation stung because it was partially true. Sarah had been running, though not from cowardice or failure. She had been running from the person she became on missions, the cold efficiency that allowed her to make impossible decisions without hesitation. She had been running from the nightmares, from the faces of people she had killed, from the weight of secrets that could never be shared even with family or friends. Flying transports had seemed like a path back to normalcy, to a version of military service that did not require her to become someone she barely recognized. She tried to explain this to Morrison without revealing too much emotion. Officers were supposed to maintain professional distance, especially when discussing classified work. But Morrison seemed to understand or at least accept her explanation. He had his own combat experience, visible in the ribbons on his uniform and the way he carried himself. He probably had his own nightmares, his own secrets, his own reasons for choosing shore duty over continued deployment to war zones. Morrison told her that her grounding was lifted effective immediately. In fact, given her newly revealed qualifications, she was being moved to a different training track. The squadron needed pilots capable of high-risk missions, including potential combat operations in contested airspace. Her special operations background made her ideal for such assignments, whether she wanted them or not. The Navy had invested in her training, and now it was time for her to prove that investment was worthwhile. Sarah felt her carefully planned future shifting again. She had accepted the Super Hornet assignment, hoping to fly impressive aircraft while maintaining her comfortable distance from actual combat. Now Morrison was explicitly planning to put her in situations where her SEAL training might become relevant again. This was exactly what she had been avoiding for 15 years, but refusing was not really an option. Morrison had orders from higher up the chain of command, orders that came from people who now knew about her background and expected her to use it. Sarah was trapped by her own past, forced to return to a level of service she had deliberately left behind. She acknowledged Morrison's instructions and was dismissed, walking out of his office feeling like she had just been drafted into a war she thought she had escaped. The change in her status was immediately apparent. That afternoon, she received new training schedules that included advanced tactical courses, weapons qualification, and joint operations exercises with other special warfare units. Her next flight would not be a simple shakedown mission, but rather a complex air combat scenario designed to test her ability to operate in hostile environments. Other pilots in the squadron noticed the shift and started treating her differently. Word had spread, probably through Morrison or his staff, that Sarah had special operations experience. Nobody knew the details, but the classification markings on her updated service record told them everything they needed to know. She was no longer just another pilot earning her place in the squadron. She was someone with capabilities they did not fully understand, someone who had done things they could only imagine. Jake Russo approached her in the ready room with a mixture of respect and curiosity. He asked if the rumors were true, if she had really been part of naval special warfare. Sarah gave him a non-committal response, neither confirming nor denying, but acknowledging that her background included assignments she could not discuss. Jake accepted this with a nod, clearly understanding that some questions should not be pressed. But she could see him reassessing her, looking for signs of the operator hidden beneath the surface of the competent pilot he thought he knew. Emily Vance was more direct. She cornered Sarah in the locker room and stated flatly that she had suspected something like this from the beginning. The way Sarah carried herself, the way she analyzed situations, the way she flew that first unauthorized aerobatic sequence, all pointed to combat experience far beyond what any transport pilot should possess. Emily asked if Sarah was okay with being pulled back into that world after so long away from it. The question was more perceptive than Sarah expected. She admitted that she was conflicted, grateful for the opportunity to truly fly fighters again, but concerned about what else might come with it. Emily suggested that maybe it was time to stop running from her past and accept that her SEAL training was part of who she was, not something to hide or be ashamed of. Some people spent their whole lives looking for purpose, and Sarah had found hers at a young age. Walking away from it had not made her happier, just more comfortable. Sarah wanted to argue, to insist that comfort was valuable and that she had good reasons for leaving special operations. But Emily's words resonated with a truth she had been avoiding. The last 15 years had been comfortable but also hollow in ways she rarely acknowledged. Flying transports was safe and respectable, but it had never given her the sense of purpose she had felt during her SEAL days. She had traded intensity for stability, and now she was being offered a chance to reclaim what she had lost. That night, Sarah pulled out a box she kept in the back of her closet, hidden beneath old uniforms and gear she rarely used. Inside were items from her time with NSA dollars that she had kept despite knowing she should probably destroy them. A team patch worn and faded, a challenge coin from a mission she could not speak about, photographs of people she had served with, some of whom had not survived their service. She had not looked at these things in years, afraid of the emotions they might stir up. Now she studied each item, remembering the person she had been and wondering if that person still existed somewhere inside her. The young operator who had completed Hell Week when most of her class had quit. The combat veteran who had carried wounded teammates through hostile territory. The pilot who had flown missions that required skills and courage beyond what training could fully prepare anyone for. That person had been capable of extraordinary things, but she had also been harder, colder, more willing to make terrible choices in service of mission objectives. Sarah did not know if she wanted to be that person again. But she was beginning to suspect that she did not have a choice. The Navy had invested in her training and now it needed her skills. The world was becoming more dangerous, with increasing tensions in regions where American forces operated. Fighter pilots who could also operate like special forces operators were rare and valuable. She had that combination of skills whether she liked it or not. The next morning, Sarah reported for her first advanced training flight with a different mindset. Instead of trying to hide her capabilities, she would embrace them. Instead of being afraid of who she used to be, she would accept that her past made her uniquely qualified for missions others could not handle. Morrison wanted to see what she could really do, so she would show him. The training scenario was complex, involving multiple aircraft, simulated threats, and objectives that required both combat skill and tactical thinking. Sarah flew her Super Hornet through the exercise with aggressive confidence, making decisions that other pilots hesitated over, taking calculated risks that paid off, demonstrating the kind of capability that came from real combat experience rather than just training. Her performance was exceptional, and everyone watching knew it. She dominated the exercise, outflying more experienced pilots and accomplishing objectives that were supposed to be difficult if not impossible. When she landed and shut down her aircraft, the crew chiefs and other pilots were looking at her with new respect. This was not the quiet transport pilot who had arrived a week ago. 3 weeks later, Sarah stood on the deck of the USS Ronald Reagan as it cut through the Pacific Ocean toward the South China Sea. The carrier deployment had come faster than anyone expected, driven by escalating tensions with Chinese forces that were becoming increasingly aggressive in disputed waters. The entire squadron had been mobilized with minimal warning, their training compressed into intensive daily flights that pushed every pilot to their limits. Sarah had thrived during those 3 weeks. Once she stopped hiding her capabilities, everything became easier. She flew with the confidence of someone who had nothing left to prove, executing complex maneuvers that made other pilots shake their heads in amazement. Morrison had watched her progress with satisfaction, occasionally pulling her aside to discuss tactics or ask her opinion on mission planning. She was becoming his go-to pilot for anything challenging or unusual. The deployment briefing happened in a secure room deep in the carrier's interior. Morrison stood at the front with a digital map showing the South China Sea and surrounding territories. Red symbols marked Chinese installations on disputed islands, including new airfields and missile batteries that had appeared in recent months. Blue symbols showed American and Allied positions, significantly outnumbered by the expanding Chinese presence. Morrison explained the situation with clinical precision. Chinese forces were claiming territorial waters far beyond what international law recognized, harassing fishing vessels and commercial ships from Allied nations. American warships had been conducting freedom of navigation operations to challenge these claims, but the Chinese were becoming bolder, sending their own fighters to intercept American aircraft and their ships to shadow American vessels at dangerously close distances. The squadron's mission was to maintain air superiority over the carrier group and be ready to respond to any hostile actions. This meant combat air patrols flying day and night, ready to intercept Chinese aircraft if they approached too close or showed hostile intent. It also meant preparing for scenarios that nobody wanted to discuss openly, but everyone understood were possible. If shooting started, they would be the first line of defense and potentially the first to engage enemy forces. Sarah listened with the focused attention of someone who had been in similar briefings before, though in very different contexts. SEAL mission briefings had covered different objectives, but the underlying reality was the same. They were being positioned in a place where violence was possible, where decisions made in seconds could have international consequences, where training and skill would be tested against real threats rather than simulated ones. After the briefing ended, Morrison asked Sarah to stay behind. Once the room cleared, he pulled up additional information on the secure terminal, classified material that had not been shared with the full squadron. Intelligence reports indicated that Chinese forces were planning something significant in the disputed territories, possibly an attempt to seize additional islands or intimidate regional allies into accepting their territorial claims. American forces were being positioned to deter such actions, but if deterrence failed, they would need to respond quickly and effectively. Morrison told Sarah that she was being assigned to a special alert status. If a crisis developed, if the situation escalated beyond routine intercepts and posturing, she would be among the first pilots launched. Her combination of fighter skills and special operations experience made her ideal for high-risk missions that might require improvisation and unconventional thinking. He asked if she was ready for that responsibility. Sarah had known this was coming from the moment her SEAL background was revealed. She told Morrison she was ready, and she meant it. The reluctance she had felt weeks ago had faded, replaced by a sense of purpose she had not experienced in years. This was what she was trained for, what she was good at, and trying to hide from it had been foolish. If the Navy needed her to fly dangerous missions, she would fly them and do it better than anyone else could. The first week of deployment was routine. Sarah flew combat air patrols, circling high above the carrier group while watching radar screens for any sign of Chinese aircraft. She saw plenty of them, fighters and patrol planes testing American responses, seeing how close they could get before being intercepted. The encounters were professional but tense, both sides flying within meters of each other, demonstrating capability without actually shooting. During one patrol, Sarah intercepted a Chinese J-20 stealth fighter that had approached closer than usual. She positioned her Super Hornet alongside the Chinese aircraft, close enough to see the other pilot's helmet through the canopy. They flew, in formation for several minutes, neither pilot giving ground, both demonstrating their skill and confidence. The Chinese pilot eventually broke off and returned to his base, but not before making a gesture that Sarah interpreted as grudging respect. Emily Vance, who had been flying wing position during the intercept, commented over the radio that Sarah seemed unusually comfortable with such aggressive flying. Sarah replied that she had done similar intercepts before, though she did not specify when or where. Emily did not press for details, understanding that some experiences remained classified even among squadron mates. The routine was broken on the 8th day of deployment. Sarah was in the ready room studying intelligence reports when the alert sounded. All pilots were ordered to their aircraft immediately. Chinese forces had made a move, landing troops on one of the disputed islands and raising their flag over what had previously been neutral territory. American commanders were deciding how to respond, and they wanted fighters in the air ready for any contingency. Sarah ran to the flight deck with other pilots, the organized chaos of a carrier launch unfolding around her. Crew members were positioning, aircraft, loading weapons, fueling jets, all with the practiced efficiency of people who had done this thousands of times. Sarah reached her Super Hornet and began the pre-flight checks, moving faster than usual but not so fast that she missed anything important. Her aircraft was armed with live weapons this time, not training rounds. Air-to-air missiles hung from the hardpoints, real warheads with real explosives designed to destroy real targets. Sarah had carried weapons before during her SEAL days, but there was something different about sitting in a fighter jet loaded with missiles. The scale of potential violence was larger, the consequences of using these weapons more dramatic. She launched with 3 other fighters, catapulted off the carrier deck and into the sky within seconds. The acceleration was brutal, pressing her back into the seat as the catapult threw her aircraft from 0 to flying speed almost instantaneously. Then she was airborne, climbing away from the carrier and forming up with the other fighters in her flight. Morrison's voice came over the radio, providing updated tasking. They were to proceed to the disputed island and establish an air patrol overhead. Chinese fighters were already in the area, likely providing cover for their forces on the ground. American aircraft were to maintain a presence and be ready to defend themselves if engaged, but were not to initiate hostilities without explicit orders. The rules of engagement were clear but narrow, requiring them to absorb the first shot before they could respond. Sarah acknowledged the orders and led her flight toward the island. The flight took 20 minutes, and during that time she ran through mental checklists of tactics and responses. If shooting started, it would happen fast. She would need to react instantly, making decisions that might mean life or death for herself and her wingmen. This was not a training exercise where mistakes just meant a bad debrief. This was real, with real stakes. The island appeared on the horizon, a small piece of land barely large enough for the airfield the Chinese had built there. Sarah could see aircraft on the ground and ships in the surrounding waters. Her radar showed multiple contacts in the air, Chinese fighters circling the area in similar patrol patterns. She counted 6 hostile aircraft, outnumbering her 4-plane flight but not by an overwhelming margin. She positioned her flight at 15,000 feet, offset from the Chinese aircraft, but close enough that any move by either side would be immediately obvious. The Chinese pilots adjusted their pattern to mirror the American formation, maintaining separation but demonstrating that they were watching and ready to respond to any aggression. For an hour, the two groups of fighters circled each other like wary predators, neither side willing to back down but neither wanting to start a shooting war. Sarah kept her finger near the weapon release button, ready to engage if the Chinese made any hostile move. Her radar warning receiver chirped occasionally as Chinese aircraft painted her with their targeting radars, checking if they could get a lock. She did the same to them, demonstrating that she was equally capable of engaging if necessary. Then her radio crackled with a transmission from the carrier. New orders were coming through, and Sarah listened carefully as Morrison explained the situation. American commanders had decided to challenge the Chinese landing by sending Marines to the same island. Her flight was to provide air cover for the Marine helicopters during their approach and landing. This was escalation, a deliberate American response that would likely provoke Chinese opposition. The Marine helicopters appeared as small dots on Sarah's radar, approaching from the carrier at low altitude. She counted 4 CH-53 Sea Stallions, heavy transport helicopters carrying teams of Marines ready to establish an American presence on the disputed island. The helicopters were vulnerable, slow and unable to defend themselves against fighter aircraft. Protecting them was now Sarah's primary responsibility, and she positioned her flight between the incoming helicopters and the Chinese fighters. The Chinese pilots immediately recognized what was happening. Their formation tightened and they began descending, moving to intercept the helicopters before they could reach the island. Sarah's radar warning receiver screamed as multiple Chinese aircraft locked their weapon systems onto her flight. She did not have clearance to fire first, but she could certainly position herself to make any Chinese attack as difficult as possible. She called out directions to her wingmen, spreading them across the sky in a defensive screen that the Chinese would have to penetrate to reach the helicopters. Emily Vance took the high position, ready to dive on any Chinese fighter that tried to break through. Jake Russo covered the left flank, his voice tight with tension as he reported multiple radar locks. The fourth pilot, a quiet veteran named Chen, held the right side and calmly called out the distances as the Chinese fighters approached. The Marine helicopters were 5 minutes out when the first Chinese fighter made his move. A J-20 broke formation and dove toward the helicopters, clearly intending to buzz them at close range to intimidate the pilots. Sarah reacted instantly, rolling her Super Hornet and cutting across the Chinese fighter's path. She did not have authorization to shoot, but she could make it very clear that any attack on the helicopters would be met with immediate response. The Chinese pilot saw her coming and pulled up sharply, avoiding a collision by mere meters. Sarah could see his helmet through the canopy as they flashed past each other, could imagine the adrenaline he was feeling as this peaceful patrol suddenly turned into a high-stakes game of chicken. She pulled hard into a climbing turn, keeping her aircraft between him and the helicopters. Morrison's voice came over the radio, asking for status. Sarah reported the aggressive Chinese maneuver and requested clarification on rules of engagement. Could she fire if the Chinese made another run at the helicopters? Morrison's response was frustratingly cautious. She was authorized to defend the helicopters using the minimum necessary force. If the Chinese attacked, she could engage, but she was to avoid firing first if any other option existed. Sarah acknowledged, though she understood the impossible position this put her in. She had to wait for the Chinese to shoot before she could shoot back, which meant giving them the first move and potentially the tactical advantage. In her SEAL days, such restrictive rules would have been unthinkable. You engage threats before they could engage you, using surprise and overwhelming force to ensure your survival. But this was not a covert operation in some remote location. This was a confrontation between nuclear powers, broadcast to the world, where every action would be analyzed and judged by politicians and diplomats. The Marine helicopters were 3 minutes out now, and the Chinese fighters were getting more aggressive. 2 more J-20s broke formation and approached from different angles, clearly coordinating their efforts to penetrate the American defensive screen. Sarah called out warnings to her flight and adjusted her position, trying to cover multiple angles simultaneously. This was exactly the kind of complex tactical situation she had trained for, both as a fighter pilot and as a SEAL. Multiple threats, limited resources, high stakes, no perfect solutions. Emily Vance engaged one of the approaching Chinese fighters, positioning her Super Hornet to force him to break off or risk collision. The Chinese pilot held his course longer than was safe, demonstrating either exceptional courage or dangerous recklessness. At the last second, he rolled away, passing so close to Emily's aircraft that their wingtips nearly touched. Emily's voice came over the radio, sharp with adrenaline but steady, reporting the near miss and maintaining her position. Sarah watched her radar screen and saw what the Chinese were really doing. While 2 fighters made obvious aggressive moves that drew American attention, the other 4 were repositioning to attack the helicopters from an unexpected angle. It was a good tactic, and it would work if Sarah did not counter it immediately. She called out new positions to her flight, shifting their defensive screen to cover the real threat. But that meant leaving gaps in their coverage that the Chinese could exploit. Sarah made a split-second decision, breaking from her assigned position and diving toward the 4 Chinese fighters that were setting up their attack run. This put her aircraft between all 6 Chinese fighters and the vulnerable helicopters, but it also left her isolated from her wingmen. If the Chinese decided to engage her, she would be facing 6-to-1 odds with no immediate support. The Chinese flight leader saw her move and understood what she was doing. For a moment, Sarah could almost feel his decision process, the calculations of risk and benefit, the consideration of whether this confrontation was worth escalating to actual combat. She armed her missiles, making sure her radar was actively tracking all 6 Chinese aircraft. The message was clear. If they attacked the helicopters, she would engage them. Consequences be damned. The Marine helicopters were 1 minute out now, close enough that Sarah could see them visually below her position. They were flying low and fast, trying to minimize their exposure to potential attacks. The Chinese fighters were in perfect position to intercept, and Sarah was the only thing stopping them. Her heart pounded in her chest, but her hands were steady on the controls. This was the moment everything had been building toward. The test that would prove whether 15 years away from combat had dulled her edge or simply stored it for later use. Then the Chinese flight leader did something unexpected. He transmitted on the international emergency frequency, speaking in accented but clear English. He stated that American helicopters were entering Chinese territorial waters without authorization. Any attempt to land on the island would be considered an act of aggression. His fighters were prepared to defend Chinese sovereignty using all necessary means. Sarah responded immediately, also on the emergency frequency. She identified herself by call sign and stated that her aircraft were operating in international airspace and defending legitimate military operations. The island was disputed territory, not recognized Chinese sovereign land. Her mission was to ensure the safety of American forces, and she was prepared to engage any aircraft that threatened those forces. The exchange was formal, almost ritualistic, but it served an important purpose. Both sides were making their intentions clear, establishing the narrative that would be analyzed after whatever happened next. Sarah knew that every word was being recorded, that her voice would be played in briefing rooms and government offices around the world. She kept her tone professional, calm, projecting confidence rather than aggression. The Marine helicopters reached the island and began their landing approach. This was the critical moment when they were most vulnerable, moving slowly and unable to maneuver effectively. The Chinese fighters adjusted their positions, clearly preparing to make their move. Sarah tensed, her finger moving to the weapon release button. If they attacked, she would have perhaps 2 seconds to respond before the helicopters were in danger. But the Chinese flight leader made a different choice. His fighters maintained their positions but did not attack. They circled aggressively, demonstrating their readiness and capability, but they did not cross the line into actual violence. Sarah understood the calculation. Shooting down American helicopters would mean war, or something very close to it. Neither side wanted that outcome, despite all the posturing and aggressive flying. The helicopters landed safely, and Marines began deploying onto the island, establishing positions near but not directly confronting the Chinese forces already there. 2 groups of armed soldiers representing different nations were now occupying the same small piece of disputed land. The situation was absurd and dangerous. a confrontation that could explode into violence at any moment or continue indefinitely in tense stalemate. Sarah maintained her position overhead, watching both the Marines on the ground and the Chinese fighters in the air. Her fuel was getting low and she would need to return to the carrier soon, but she was determined to stay as long as possible to ensure the Marines had air cover. Morrison finally ordered her flight to return to the carrier for refueling, and Sarah complied reluctantly, turning away from the island while keeping her sensors focused on the Chinese aircraft until they were out of range. The landing back on the carrier was technically perfect, but Sarah barely noticed. Her mind was still processing the confrontation, analyzing decisions she had made and considering alternatives. She had been prepared to fire on the Chinese fighters if they had attacked the helicopters. That reality was sobering. After 15 years of avoiding combat, she had come within seconds of potentially starting an international incident that could have led to war. Morrison met her on the flight deck after she shut down her aircraft.